at their wedding. And it was this just amazing human interest story. And it was all over the papers. And then it just vanishes. It just vanishes overnight when Pearl Harbor happens. Of course, he's shipped out. The country's mood has changed. We're not sort of emerging from the Depression anymore. Now there's a national crisis. And these feel-good stories just didn't have the same cultural resonance. And so I had found this story just by doing a search of newspaper archives with the phrase "met at Central Park and married," and was stunned just to see Willis Langford or Joey Phillip just never reappear after 1941. And thinking, there's no way that either of these two folks are alive anymore. I mean, 1941, they're probably both gone. Who knows what happened to them? Because one of the criteria I had for the book was that I wanted at least one of the spouses to still be alive. Because I did want to interview them and get those rich details. And so enter Google. I put the name Willis Langford in Google, and up pops this page for this guy, this old-looking dude who has a little bio, and he talks about having 4 kids and 8 grandkids and 16 great-grandchildren. The age is almost exactly right, and I'm like, what is he doing with a web page? But it turns out he's selling nutritional supplements in California. And when I met him, he attributed vitamins for his spry form after he's like 89 years old. And so I wrote to him. I said, by any chance, are you Prince Charming, basically? And he wrote back in this very sort of formal prose. He said, yes, I am indeed the same party. And no one had asked him about this since 1941. And I wanted to know, so whatever happened to Joey? How did that work out? I mean, did you guys stay? I mean, I was afraid because it was a beautiful story, but I was worried it would have the same ending as the Brooklyn Bridge story I told you about. He said we'd been married for 64 years. She died 4 years ago. And they had all these sort of offspring. And it was really just tremendous to think that it's one thing to meet somebody, to exchange phone numbers, go on a date, it doesn't work out. But for something to stick like that for all those years. And one of the things that you find out in the postscript for this story is that while Willis had these very fond memories of the story and still had great pride in the story, his wife, Joey, did not. She wouldn't talk about it. She didn't want to celebrate it. She didn't want to remember it because for her, those were some of the most difficult and painful weeks of her life. To be living as a vagrant in Central Park, to be sleeping on the subways, to have been groped by men on the subway while she was sleeping, not something she had pride in. So there is a richness, I think, to how these stories turn out. And I didn't want to, people can sort of turn to those at the end to sort of figure out where the couples are. And they all have different relationships with their stories. So that was a very, very long answer to your very good question. Anyone else? Anyone want to share a New York City love story? Yeah? How did you meet?
I'm from Spain, she's from Argentina.
Uh-huh.
I'm transferred from Holland,
Mm-hmm.
working in Holland, in the same company. But if they ask me, do you want to make the second part of the book?
Ah, okay. Where were you when you met? Where were you? Were you in a public place? Were you? Yeah. Where about? At a bar. Okay. Okay. Oh yes. Okay. Wonderful. Yeah. Great.
I had arrived like a week before that, and it's embarrassing. Like a week before that, because I was going to do some workshops here. I'm a makeup artist, and that day I said, I need someone to talk to me because I'm going to go crazy. And I got into the bar from the corner of the apartment I rented, and a minute later I stopped on him. And from that moment,
do you remember what he said to you? What was
nothing.
Nothing.
I didn't
Just the
know
way you
what
looked at her.
language he speaks.
Oh, okay.
We both speak Spanish.
Wonderful. Yeah.
And he made like a gesture like this. I'm from Argentina, so I started laughing because it's like, do you want to? In Argentina, that means if you want to dance tango.
Really?
Yeah. So I laughed and I said.
That's great. And in fact, that reminds me of another story in the book where it was a Frenchman who was in New York working learning English because he wanted to go to business school and his English scores weren't good enough, and a dancer from Maryland who was studying at NYU for the summer, And this is another Washington Square Park story. She's sitting there working on her Spanish homework. He walks in after basically abandoning a job search. He's had a miserable day. He hasn't been able to get interviews with anybody. He walks into the park, and he's struck by this woman. She's sort of this tomboyish woman, and she has this sort of perfect sort of dancer's posture. And this guy's been in a relationship with somebody for like 12 years, so he doesn't really know what you're supposed to say to somebody. He probably shouldn't be saying anything, but he is sort of taken with her, and in a very kind of childish way, just begins kind of staring at her across the ledges in Washington Square Park. And he kind of looks at her, and as she described it later, it wasn't sort of a hard, threatening stare. It was just very open, kind of boyish stare. She felt like he was sort of revealing himself to her in some way. And so, believe it or not, and maybe this is only the kind of thing that Frenchmen can pull off, but they basically were staring at each other for half an hour. She decides to like return. She's like, why? She notices this guy staring at her, and she's like, what's up with that? So instead of like turning away or being coy, she just like, she turns and goes like this, like just meets his stare head on. She's like, I can, you know what, if he wants, we're going to, two can play this game. It's sort of they played a game of chicken essentially. And as he described it afterwards, he felt like they had gone through all the phases of love in this half an hour. The loss, despair, a restoration of hope, and you could read all these emotions, and they had this sort of wordless intimacy for a full half hour, and he, I think, was ready to let this stand as a moment of poetry, and just sort of walk away from it. They'd exchanged something beautiful. Why spoil it with words? And I think he was rather struck when, after a half an hour, she gets up from the sort of lotus position she's in and walks right up to him, and she's like, I've had enough. I'm hungry. I got to go get something to eat. And he says, wait. So I think this the nonverbal thing, I think, is big, and I think this is unusual. I mean, even they admitted it was kind of bizarre that like they would have this staring contest for a half an hour. But again, it took somebody getting up and saying, enough of this nonsense. Either there's something here or there isn't, but we're not going to just play this game anymore. And so I applaud you for reading the signals right and for acting on them. Yeah. Yes.
Hello. I came because my parents have a New York City story. They back in the 70s, my mother was a Vegas showgirl, and my father was a flamenco guitarist. So it's semi-typical in the fact that they were playing at this place called the Chateau Madrid. It's on West 48th. I'm sure it doesn't exist anymore, but in the 70s, it was a big hoorah with Spanish artists and people and dancing and dinner. And basically what happened was my mom was the first act and my father was the second. And he was immediately turned on to her. So he went out. They were both there for 2 weeks. So he would go backstage, and there was about 20 dancers and looking for her, and they met. But the funny part of the story is that she didn't like him at all. She had nothing to do with him. So after a couple of days, he would go back and look for Marlena, and she's like, I'm out of here. If he comes, looks for me, girls, tell him I went to the hotel. I'm not here. So she was not a New Yorker, but my father was. So she'd walk to the hotel. So when my father would get backstage after their show, where's Marlena? Oh, she left. He would know all the back alleyways, would run as fast as he could, and get to the hotel before she did without looking like he just ran and be like, hey, how are you? And they're still married.
Oh, wonderful. How many years now?
30-something years. They had me like 12 years later, but she kept touring countries, so they would meet at countries in the middle. If she was in Venezuela and he was in Puerto Rico, they'd meet in Miami.
Nice.
And she
Sounds
dumped Julio Iglesias for him. Can you imagine?
Oh, my gosh,
I could be
great.
Julio Iglesias' daughter. But anyway, thank you.
Thanks. That's right. Any other questions? Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, I'm interested in the public spaces. Can you elaborate a little bit more about significant characteristics that create that intimacy or create?
Sure. I mean, again, I think beauty matters. If you have, a place that is sort of visually inspiring, and the study that sort of set this off there in the 1950s, actually, there were a couple of researchers at Brandeis University who split undergraduates among two rooms. One was a beautiful room, as it was called, with big windows, beautiful mahogany desks, some tapestries, a plush sofa, and then there was an ugly room, which was sort of battleship gray walls. Tattered lampshades, like a janitor's mop just sort of sitting in the corner. And they showed both groups of students photos of faces, the same set of photos. and the students in the beautiful room rated the exact same photos far more favorably. They were photos of faces of people than those in the ugly room. So there's a sense in which the aesthetics of a surrounding do rub off on its inhabitants. I think that was certainly a factor, one of the factors for the Capels. I mean, they're surrounded by these beautiful objects, and so they in turn seem more beautiful. I do think crowds matter. I think you always have sort of a plan B when you're in a crowd. Because I think crowds offer sort of more opportunities and better cover, in a way, to strike up a conversation with somebody. Because in New York, people are sort of pressed up against each other all the time. You don't have to sort of walk across, for instance, in a subway. You might already be standing next to somebody who you find sort of interesting. And so you haven't really ventured. It's not like you've walked across a bar to buy them a drink. You haven't ventured anything. You're already there. It's only friendly to say something. And if the person isn't interested, well, that's my stop. I got to get off. So I think density brings people together and creates more opportunities. I think this triangulation thing is big, and I think adrenaline is big. I think if you're in places, it turns out that walking alone on a beach, or walking through the trees or in the woods or something, isn't particularly great because you're sort of in this low, sort of physiological state. But when you're worked up, when there's something, if you're standing atop the Empire State Building or you're surrounded by a rush of people in Grand Central Terminal. And I think New York keeps both visitors and residents alike in this kind of heightened physiological state. You have to be, because there are things coming at you and from every direction. And I think that actually puts you sort of chemically where you need to be to sort of feel and act on attraction. One of the other things, just in terms of aesthetics of a place, is that there's a guy in England who takes people on what he calls romantic walk shops. And what he does is he walks them through cities, from Barcelona to Toronto. I think he's done one in New York. And he quizzes, and he sets people up with singles up, and then he quizzes them after on the aspects of the environment that made them feel romantic. And some of the things he found were very sort of fit this paradigm. I mean, complexity is interesting. If there's sort of cobblestone streets and then some sort of modern structure next to it. People like water. A sense of enclosure is good, like the narrow sort of European-style streets. No one likes to feel like they're out on like a prairie or something where, and if you feel vulnerable. I don't know if any of you have ever been to City Hall Plaza in Boston. It's an awful public space. You feel like someone could jump out and attack you, and then compared that to the famous square in Venice, St. Marcos. I mean, so a sense of enclosure, different textures, different levels, and also people like mystery. You don't want to feel like you can see everything. You want to feel like there's always another place to explore. Like, well, what if I go around this corner? What's over there? What's up here? And then the other thing is legibility. Kevin Lynch, I think, wrote a book called The Image of the City. And that's the sense that even while there is this sense of mystery, we sort of have some sense of our bearings. You don't want to feel sort of completely lost. You want to have a sense, well, if I kind of go in this direction, I can get back to where I started. And I actually asked this Los Angeles architect I know, what is it about this sense of enclosure that's so important? And he sort of said, he kind of went back to sort of caveman days. If you're all out, if you're out alone on some prairie or something, and you wouldn't know when a sort of lion would jump out and attack you. There's a sense of safety and comfort, I think, that comes from feeling like you have a sense of where the limits of your space are. And one of the interesting barometers that William White identified when he was looking at Plaza is that women are much better, are sort of barometer for the safety of a public place. That women were more discriminating about where they would sort of spend time. So if you walked into a public space and there are only dudes hanging around, probably shouldn't be there because they tended to be sort of sketchier. But if you go to a place where there are higher proportions of women, the places tend to function better. Not necessarily because there are women there, but because women tend to be more discriminating about where they will sort of sit and eat lunch and hang out and talk with friends. Yes.
The exception to proximity to water you just described this room.
Yes.